Right, so when we think about trying to investigate something as complex as society, we need some sort of process, and I'm just going to give you a simplified version of it. I'm just going to look at the structure of a standard research report, and you won't need this level of complexity, but I want to take you through how the logic of how a report works and the logic of the research process, and there are all sorts of ifs and buts and complications and discussions we could have, but I just wanted to focus on in this thing getting a sense of the process from go to woe. And of course it never goes from go to woe. You're always doubling back and checking back and going back and rethinking what you're doing. But let's just imagine it goes from start to finish without any unexpected glitches, and then we can look at the issues in more detail. We'll look at your specific report, and then we'll come back in the next lecture and look more at some of the methodological and theoretical questions that are raised about social research and about scientific research generally. As some people have already mentioned, the question of bias and so on, so we'll talk about that. But first I just want to give you an overview of the sort of research process, and as I say, it's a designed process. You can't just go and observe. I mean, it might be true that science is based on observation, but if I just said to you, I want you to go and, as good social scientists, go and observe, off you go. You can go and observe, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You're going to say to me, well, observe what? And then once we get to observe what, we're starting to talk about our hypothesis. Sociologists don't always do it as formally as psychologists. You'll be doing some of this work in your other subjects, but our hypothesis is what you're testing when you do research, a proposed explanation that we're going to test. So that's an important understanding, that what you're doing is you're testing some idea, some proposed explanation that you might have come up with, and that might be in theory, or it might be a practical matter, what is actually going on out there, or it might be a concept you have that you want to test. And the first place you start to do that is a literature review. So a literature review, you want to find out what you know already. You don't want to go and reinvent the wheel. If there's already a working model there, you don't need to go and reinvent it, but it also, you can think of it like a conversation that you're participating in, so you don't have to start from scratch. You want to find out what others are doing, what others have already thought, and from that literature review you would then derive a research question. Once you've got a research question, then you need to know, well, how am I going to answer that research question? So if I was, when we were approached to do a livability audit of Mackay, well, we need to have a notion of what is it that we're going to, that's an empirical thing. What do people find that makes Mackay a livable area? But we have to go and look at what have people already done, what sort of work had already been done in this area. Could we just go and get a pro forma survey and run that survey, or would we have to think about it more specifically in relation to Mackay? And there's a whole body of literature around well-being and about progress indicators, and a whole world of literature that we could sort of draw on to make sense of this notion of livability and how we might use it. And of course we have to talk to the client about that and what it is they're trying to do, and that's one of the great challenges, of course, is that they're not entirely clear what they're trying to do or what we can do for them. So there's a whole lot of negotiating around that to produce an outcome that everyone's happy with. Once you've got a notion of what it is you're trying to find out and what the research question is, and the research question might change as you go along too, as you learn more, but initially you have a research question, and then you've got to say, well, how am I going to answer this question? And the answer is, generally you start with sort of a theory of some kind. What sort of ideas am I going to draw on to try to answer it? And theory is just a reflection on observations or practices, so it's a generalised explanation. It's important that we don't confuse theory and hypothesis, but we'll come back to that. So a theory is a generalised explanation of something. Once you've got a sense of how you're going to approach that question, then we can look specifically at how we're going to test it, how we're going to test what Mackayites think of as livable, and how does that compare to the southeast corner of Queensland. In this case, the work we were doing for the Regional Economic Development Corporation, so they're interested in it for marketing purposes. So we need to think about what we might be interested in as social scientists, but also what the client's interested in terms of they want something they can use to promote the region. So we need to try to keep that sort of client-specific stuff, and then what we can do with it as social scientists in terms of understanding how society works which is a related question but not the same as what the client might be looking for. For researchers, it's can be important to do a survey that can be comparable to other surveys, but that may be of no interest to the client who just wants to find out what people think. So there's usually some discussion then about how to frame the questions and how, so we can make it comparable and to convince them that it's worth doing a bit extra, usually to make those comparisons. The method is the specific way you're going to test your explanation. So in case of a survey of Mackay, then we're going to have to use the population research lab to randomly survey a large number of people with this very specific set of questions that we had in mind. So it was a very quantitative research project, and we'll be asking you to participate as a participant in a project like that on SurveyMonkey a bit later in the term. From that survey then comes a whole bunch of data and results, what everybody's answers are on different scales, true or false, or a Likert scale, the 5-point scales you've probably seen if you've done any kind of surveys, from love it to hate it, and five points in between. But then once we've gone to all that trouble of collecting the data and getting it all tabulated onto a giant spreadsheet, then we've got to do some sort of analysis of it. That's part of the method as well. How are we going to make sense of this data? And once we've done that, we've got a set of results. Then we can say to ourselves, okay, what does this all mean? What have we learned? And what have we added to the conversation? So we go back to our literature review and say, well, we have learnt as a result of our research, we've added this to the conversation. So that may be theory, it may be empirical, so we can say Australia is different from similar studies that are done in the US, or we've tested this instrument and got these results, so you've got another way of testing the data, testing the survey instrument. An Australian case study of the same sort of material is another common contribution you can make. Or we can look at the theory and say, well, our ways of understanding livability need to change because we've discovered this pattern in the data that tells us something about livability we didn't know. And then we pull it all together in some sort of conclusion. Usually that involves what sort of research we want to do next and where we're going to take it from here. In your case, it will just be reflections on the process and what you've learned as an individual about research and about the sociological imagination in particular. So your first assignment will just be a watered down version of that process. We've done a lot of the thinking work for you, so you don't have to worry about the literature review. You don't have to worry about theories and methods so much. What you're going to do is write an introduction that says, what is the sociological imagination, important tool in sociology, collects the private and the public, right? Stuff you've read in the last couple of weeks. You don't have to formulate a research question, but really, because you're not going to be doing, unless we pooled you all together and got you to compare, it'd be hard to make a real assessment. But what you're doing as a learning exercise is in what way, or is the sociological imagination a useful tool for understanding sociology, or in what way is it a useful tool for understanding sociology? The method how you're going to test this, whether sociological imagination is useful, is to apply that template to somebody's life story by conducting an interview. So it's qualitative research, you're doing an interview. The data will be the interview that you generate. Having done the interview and made your notes about that process, then you'll have that as data. Now the data is not the end point. Doing the interview is not the end point. We're not interested in the specific details of the interview as such, the life history as such. We are interested in you demonstrating that you understand the sociological imagination, that you've learned something about sociology and this key concept of the sociological imagination as a tool for understanding how societies work. So that's the crucial thing to write at the top of your piece of paper, or however you can keep it in mind, that the interview isn't the end point. The interview is data for you to demonstrate that you understand how the private and the public connect. What role has race and class and gender got, and other inequalities got, in this person's life history? What about culture? What cultural norms are there that we can use to talk about how culture informs someone's life history? You won't be asked to do a critique, which is a part of the sociological imagination. You'll be asked instead to record your reflections about what you've learned. So it'll be a reflective practice on the learning exercise. That's what you're doing in research, but here you're just going to do it on your own experience. Ethics is an important part of research, and this is one of the most important aspects of this work, and that's that you need to be cognizant of issues about consent. Now, consent at one level is really simple. So your interviewee needs to know what it is they're agreeing to and what will happen to the data, who will see it. So that's the first thing. They need to be really clear about what they're agreeing to. It doesn't matter if it's a global scale research report or your small one-on-one process. It's all the same sort of idea. The person needs to make informed consent. To do that, they need to be over a certain age. You need to not have power over them, so you shouldn't interview your employees if you have any, children even. Questions about power relationships are what lie at the heart of informed consent. I got consent from two of the students to interview them as an exercise on the chat, and then I asked them to edit those and we put those up online for you to look at. There are questions there about consent. I mean, yes, at one level they freely consented to be interviewed for the sake of the learning experience, but I have a position of power relative to them. So we'd have to, if we were going to have this research published, or if we were going to go more public with it than just this course, then there would be issues about informed consent, because I would have a position of power in relation to them. We can assume they knew what I was going to use it for, and we can assume that I didn't intimidate them and so on, but they would be issues to consider if this project was more than just a learning experience. If you record your notes, it's important that storage and publication are issues that are important. So what is going to happen to your recorded notes, your handwritten notes? I haven't asked you to take or transcribe the interviews, because that just raises a whole bunch of issues about storage and publication of those things. Where are they going to end up? So try to keep data storage to a minimum. It's confidential. The person has a right to know who is going to see this information. Even though we're not going to be digging around to get details of their private lives, it's still a case of it being anonymous and confidential, and that those details shouldn't be shared with anyone else. The other part of informed consent that you really need to be aware of is they have the right to withdraw at any time. Up to the time you submit your assignment, that person can say, I've changed my mind, I don't want you to do that. And they have to know it's going to be submitted for assessment, and that's all. It's not going to be published. If this work was going to be publishable, then we would have had to go through the University Ethics Committee, but while it remains in the confines of this course, then there's not an issue from the point of view of our Ethics Committee. But there are issues about you getting clear about consent. So in your research, choose someone who's a peer. Family and friends are okay, usually. There's no need to be exploring intimate personal issues. It's not a therapy session, it's not about counselling. You're not trying to find out their secrets or uncover their heartfelt stories. You're trying to find a life history, a broad outline of their life, and put it in a social context. Make written notes and destroy them when you're done. Once you've submitted the assignment, keep a backup copy for yourself, but destroy it. You don't share those notes or details with anyone else, and you have to get them to sign the consent form. If you don't, then you won't receive a grade for the assignment. So that's just to try to emphasise how important ethics is. If you send it in, we will write to you and demand in an annoyed tone that you please provide the consent form with a signature, otherwise we won't be releasing the grades to you. So where are you in this process at the moment? Well, you should have read it. You should have started reading up on the sociological imagination and begin to understand each part of it. Now, we're fully aware that this is your second week of sociology. You probably never heard the word before 2 weeks ago, or when you enrolled a month ago. And you'll be submitting this in week 5, so we're not expecting you to be world's best interviewer or world's best sociologist, but we just want to get you out there experiencing, doing a simple bit of social research. One of the things you might have to do, though, is to explain to your interviewee, if they ask you about race and class and gender, that's what you're trying to find out. And you may not need to ask them directly about race and class and gender. But if you do, if that happens in an interview, you need to be prepared to explain those concepts in a simple way to them. So quoting a definition out of Gurmov or out of Willis isn't going to cut it. You're going to need to put it in your own words. So I've asked to see that where you're preparing for your interview, you've written a few lines about how you would explain class and race and gender to a non-sociological outsider. So that and the consent form, that template that I've given you just as a bit of a shape, to give your interview a bit of shape, but the terminology, the way you're going to explain those things, I've asked you to include those, and that'll be an appendix to your report. So again, be clear that they understand what you're asking them to do, that it'll take 30 to 45 minutes or an hour, that it's going to be used for your assessment purposes, that you're going to use examples from their life history for an assessment exercise and make sure they sign the form. You should conduct the interview and then make notes as you go, and then you should, once the interview's finished, then you should do some immediate reflections once you get home or once you get away from the person, just to think about that process and how it went and what you learned, and start to think about what sort of themes came out in each one. And you can see that in the samples that I've put up already, just in the mock-up interviews that I did on the chat. Now, referencing. There's lots of different referencing systems, but I did say to the students online that it's mostly in the textbook. Well, that's certainly true for most of the sociological imagination stuff. You need to be locating that life history and social patterns, so you may need to document those. If you're going to make claims about unemployment or amount of housework that women do, or what else, how many hours people work, or whatever might have come out in those interviews, then you might need to look elsewhere. The textbook should pretty well cover it, but then you do need to go beyond the textbook, just in terms of a couple of journal articles, a couple of chapters, just to get a range of sources. I'd expect 6 different sources. You can use the databases on the library website, but be wary about how you use just broad internet searches. Part of the competency in this course isn't just doing a Google search and whatever comes up first on the Google search is what I'm going to use. So don't use encyclopedias and dictionaries. They are not reliable references. They are not detailed enough or specific enough for sociological purposes. You can use a sociological dictionary if you have one, but even then, these things are like starting points. Nothing wrong with looking up at something on Wikipedia is to get your thinking going about issues, but you need to learn to assess whether a source is reliable and sociological, has some authority behind it. Because the great thing about the internet is anyone can write on it and say their piece, which is fantastic. But in terms of research, you could be copying the work of a primary school child or another first-year student like yourself, or you need to be aware of how to assess those sort of sources. Now you can see here referencing. There's a simple reference. I mentioned Allbrow in the course of that lecture as the source from which I sort of put together my definition of sociology, and so I've referenced that one. The point of referencing is about plagiarism. The point is that we acknowledge where other ideas came from, we acknowledge where we got information from, and then we build our arguments from that theory and empirical base. None of us, creates things out of the top of our head. And I'll leave you in this section with the question about whether or not there should be other references in this reference list. So I'll leave you to ponder that question about what that reference list should include. So I'll leave that with you, and I'll see you in the next part. Ciao.